2005, we had a very rare, massive public protest, something that didn't happen often in already very repressive Uzbekistan. It was the culmination of weeks of peaceful protests by residents of the city of Andijan, who were witnessing an ongoing trial of 23 businessmen in a community, providers of jobs, very important members of the community, who were brought up on charges very common in Uzbekistan, charges of religious extremism. These are charges the Uzbek government for years has used to imprison its critics, people it perceives to be opponents of the government. And this caused an outburst of discontent. There was a small group within this larger group of peaceful protesters that on the night of May 12th broke into several government buildings, broke out of jail the 23 businessmen, and occupied a few other government buildings. They then moved to the central square of Andijan, but then something very surprising happened. Thousands of people joined this smaller demonstration, smaller group, to discuss larger grievances they had with their government, including socioeconomic abuses, corruption, government repression. You had a large outpouring of thousands of people coming onto the central square. They thought that the government was going to address their concerns, there would be some sort of dialogue, perhaps even President Karimov would address the crowd. What he did instead was surround the central square of Andijan with tanks, cutting off all exits from the square, and as May 13th progressed, his troops, he gave the order to fire on the protesters, largely peaceful protesters, overwhelmingly peaceful protesters, shooting indiscriminately into the crowd, killing women and children. Human Rights Watch later interviewed eyewitnesses of the event who had fled across the border to Kyrgyzstan, and the evidence that we collected pointed to shooting incidents that killed up to 300 and 400 persons at one time. Other killings were conducted execution style, coming up to people where they lay and shooting them point blank. This was an excessive, disproportionate response by the government to an overwhelmingly peaceful protest. And in the aftermath of Andijan, rather than accede to the calls for international investigation made at that time by the US government, the European Union, the NATO Council, the OSCE, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Uzbek government cracked down massively, imprisoning at first dozens of human rights defenders and journalists, but later a much larger swath of organizations were targeted. Radio Free Europe was expelled, Voice of America was expelled. Since Andijan, the Uzbek government has not allowed any scrutiny of its human rights record. In fact, in the last year, the International Committee of the Red Cross was forced to discontinue its visitation of prisoners and detainees, which is something quite unique in the world. It made a rare public statement that it was unable to conduct monitoring because of the interference by the Uzbek government. And on the whole, Uzbekistan's human rights record has grown increasingly severe in these last 10 years. Torture is endemic in the criminal justice system, as you'll hear more from my colleague at Amnesty International. They just released a groundbreaking report on this subject. But it's gotten so bad, just to give you one example, that the Norwegian government in December, actually in February of this year, recently suspended all returns of any persons on any grounds at all to Uzbekistan based on concerns about torture. That's because in December, 6 Uzbeks were returned from Norway, promptly charged with trumped-up charges of extremism, paraded on television with signs of torture. Several other European countries have followed suit and completely stopped returning people to Uzbekistan. Other issues on the human rights agenda for the United States and Uzbekistan are the massive mobilization of adults to pick cotton during the cotton harvest in Uzbekistan. This practice includes up to 4 million adults and begins in September during the fall cotton harvest, ending in early November. There's total censorship of the media. We just recently saw President Karimov reelected to his 4th term in office, even though the Constitution only allows for 2 consecutive terms, in an election that the OSCE determined was neither free nor fair. Let me move on to recommendations for U.S. policy. I've started out with a really dark picture, but I think the main message that we have is that there is hope, that Uzbekistan actually is not a hopeless case. Pressure can work on this government. And I think actually Mahira's case is a good one. We believe that Human Rights Watch, the US policy, needs to shift to one of principled engagement. The last 6 years in particular, with the emergence of the Northern Distribution Network, where the US has utilized transit routes in Uzbekistan to transit supplies down into Afghanistan, has unfortunately meant that the policy tools the US has in 3 separate pieces of legislation, the Appropriations Act, which places restrictions on military assistance to Tashkent, the Trafficking in Persons Act, under which Uzbekistan has been categorized for the last 2 years as a Tier 3 abuser in terms of its forced labor problem and human trafficking problem. And also, I should say, the third, it's been listed as a country of particular concern since 2006 for its serial violations of religious freedom, something my colleague Catherine Cosman will discuss in further detail. Those are 3 acts or 3 pieces of legislation where the U.S. has potentially envisioned sanctions for Uzbekistan's behavior, but all of them have been waived by the Obama administration. We think that there has to be more conditionality. What we've seen in the last few years is that when Uzbekistan was actually placed as a Tier 3 country on the trafficking list, it was only 1 month later that the government actually allowed the International Labour Organization into the country, which is something that had been sought for many years by human rights advocates and by diplomats. But what we've seen again and again is that Karimov does respond to pressure when it's tied to meaningful policy consequences. We think that is what should happen. We think Uzbek officials implicated in the Andijan killings should be put on a list. Their assets should be frozen. Their visas should be denied. Examples like Magnitsky, perhaps global Magnitsky, could do a lot for Uzbekistan. The other initiative we've been discussing, and we think the Lantos Commission could explore more, is the support by the U.S. government for a UN country expert, a UN special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan leads the way in the number of UN human rights experts it has denied access to the country since 2002. 12 experts in 13 years. That's more than almost any other country, I think, barring Zimbabwe and Venezuela. So Uzbekistan needs more pressure, obviously. And we think by speaking out, by increasing the public diplomacy, and making specific remarks about political prisoners in Uzbekistan, the Obama administration and the US government as a whole can do a lot more and achieve concrete results. Thank you.